Hello everyone and welcome to Archaea Viking. Today's video is a somewhat special video because recent events within the US government and Supreme Court have put the rights of certain individuals at risk. Granted, at the moment, some more than others, but others are definitely at risk as well. And the subject of today's video is that of homosexuality, gender fluidity, and magic during the Viking Age. And I'm making this video because while certain rights involving Roe versus Wade and other things are currently more in jeopardy, things involving things such as gay marriage and other LGBTQ plus rights have been put at risk. And to be fair, granted, I don't, as a moderate, I don't always agree with or understand necessarily some of the things that the LGBT community says or does, but it's not my responsibility to understand it. As an American who believes in protecting people's rights, it is my responsibility to protect those people's rights, both as Americans and as human beings. So, without ado, let's get into the subject. So, when people hear about Vikings, they, especially in our modern age, they think about basically the show Vikings, which is people in leather armor, looking like death metal bands with oftentimes historically inaccurate weaponry and being hyper-masculine. Hyper-masculine in the modern sense. So the first question is, was this what the Viking Age was, or men in the Viking Age were? Well, sort of, but not really. So Viking Age men and women actually were very focused with hygiene. To the point that would be considered not hyper-masculine nowadays. They had beard combs for their beards and hair. They had this thing right here is an ear scooper, sort of like a Q-tip is used now, to clean out earwax. Twizzers, all kinds of things to groom themselves, to make themselves look as handsome as possible, or as attractive as possible to the other sex, to women or what have you. Something which is not considered as seen in recent things put out by people such as Tucker Carlson, not seen as what men should be doing. Furthermore, at least two sources mention that I'll link in the sources as well, cite the sources as well, mention men during the Viking Age, Scandinavian men during the Viking Age, wearing eyeliner. Now, some of the statements are a little iffy because they say like the Norsemen have blinded eyes. That's hard to say what that is. But when looking at Ibn Fadlan's, the other source, it's pretty clear that they were wearing some form of eyeliner and makeup. So, in our modern sense, no, these were not hyper-masculine men at all. But this still leads to the question, were there gay men and other LGBTQ plus individuals during the Viking Age? Because the big question of this video that has been asked by a lot of anti-LGBTQ people is like, oh, they didn't exist in history. Not usually gay people, they acknowledge that, but anything else, they didn't exist in history at all. And that's not true. So, as you can already tell in my statement, yes, they did exist. However, there's a caveat. So I want to make it clear to members of the LGBT community that the Viking Age is not a LGBTQ utopia at all. I'm sorry. I know it would be great for y'all if it was, and and it would be cool. It would be fine, to see that in reality. Unfortunately, that's not how this works, and in fact, I think it actually hurts the LGBTQ community to misunderstand what happened during the Viking Age. Now, of course, I'm not a member of that community, so they may have different takes on it, and feel free to comment on that. I'm welcome to hear it. But from what we understand, the concept of gay at the time was referred to by a term called ergi. Basically, what it means is if you were a bottom in a gay relationship, you were someone who should be mocked or outlawed or even in some cases killed. And what I mean by bottom is it was okay in the Viking Age if you were the one on top. And I don't mean literally the one on top. Basically, what it means is if you were the dominant person in the relationship, it was fine. And usually that involved a very terrible practice of male or boy slaves. Usually the people who are on bottom were not willing. Not always, and I'll cover that in a second, but they were, oftentimes not free people at all. But to those who did do it willingly, they were often called the term ergi, which we don't really have necessarily the etymology as to where it came from, but we do have one possibility is seen on this runestone where it was a curse saying that whoever does breaks some sort of crime will be like an argri or a witch woman. So argri and ergi are very similar, but not quite the same. But they have a similar enough etymology that it suggests the origin. So basically, that meant if you were accused of this, if you were accused of being a bottom in this relationship, you were to be scorned. And we can see this in several different cases, but one of the most famous ones that a member of my local art community did a video on himself that I'll link in the iCard, Asmund and Aron, who were two Norse warriors who had a blood oath, or were sworn brothers. But what's interesting about this is this blood oath seemed to have been different than other blood oaths. And it was mentioned in a couple of different sagas, but the one that's the most telling is this excerpt right here, Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum. And in it, it talks about how Asmund and Aron swore their blood oath. And it says they had lived together a short while and swore by every vow in order to ratify their friendship, which they observed to one another, that whichever of them lived longest should be buried with him who died. For their fellowship and love, emphasis, were so strong that each determined he would not prolong his days when the other was cut off by death. So that's pretty telling of what their relationship would be. Furthermore, in both of these sagas, in Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, and in the other saga of Asmund and Aron and the Icelandic sagas, mentioned that through a battle with a Draugr, that was originally Aron, after the two individuals had been buried, Asmund escaped the tomb, and with the exception of his warriors who had sworn loyalty to him and Aron, everyone else refused to have anything to do with him. Now, it doesn't say outright that this was because he was ergi, but knowing the relationship is described by Saxo Grammaticus, and looking at the context clues in the sagas and the Gesta Danorum, as well as how individuals who were called ergi were seen, it's pretty easy to assume, and not a short jump in logic, and in fact is a reasonable assumption that these two were in some form of gay relationship, especially considering Asmund eventually became a sworn brother with Aaron's actual older brother, and their relationship was far different than this. But again, that despite this, he was still ostracized. And this is likely due to a idea within the Viking Age that has been proposed by multiple scholars, that rather than there being necessarily two sexes or two genders, there was one overreaching gender in Scandinavian culture, and that was the idea of being a man or being not a man. And you can see this in several types of graves, such as these two graves that were found in Redon, England, who are associated with the Great Heathen Army, and they were buried right beside each other. One grave is a warrior who has multiple wounds on him and has multiple grave goods, such as weapons and other things that were usually accorded to warriors. Meanwhile, to the right of him is an individual who only has a dagger, and that's it. No wounds or anything, and no other grave goods. Now, it should be clear that these people were not buried together, so they weren't necessarily, individuals who had a relationship. But when it comes to grave 511, the grave of the warrior, and grave 295, the grave with the individual with no dagger, it is very striking. And it's been hypothesized by archaeologists such as Ben Ratfield that this individual in grave 295 on the right may have not been considered having achieved warriorhood or manhood. And that's why, despite being part of the Great Heathen Army, he was not given grave goods. Now, however, there should also be a caveat added to this. No army ever marches with only warriors. They're all usually, cooks, medics of some sort, whether they be healers or soothsayers or what have you, and often slave boys and such to help carry things. So it could be possible he was one of these. But then again, that still informs us as to why, despite being buried next to each other, suggesting that they were in the same battle, one received armor and weapons and other grave goods, and another received none. So all in all, whether he was a like what we could say is an equivalent to a squire or somebody in training, or a slave boy or a cook or something, he was not viewed as having achieved manhood. So that's sort of how that works within the Viking Age. Furthermore, there was a practice that was associated with ergi that has interesting connotations, which is Seidr. Seidr is a magical practice in Scandinavian culture and Sami culture, because it may have actually been diffused from the Sami culture into the Scandinavian cultures, that involves things like weaving and looms and such. And oftentimes when somebody in the sagas was accused of being an ergi, it was in context of, they took on the persona of a woman to perform this sailor magic. And in fact, in some cases, there were many graves found in Scandinavia with items that would have been seen and used by sailor, at least we think they would have, such as these deesting rods or dees rods, and various other things such as looms and such. Oftentimes it's like one item, so it's not 100% conclusive, but it does suggest that this was a practice that some men undertook and took on the persona of a woman, and therefore became viewed as ergy or, gay or some other form of that, and were to be ostracized. Uh, However, what is interesting is many scholars have suggested that this was basically they were taking on feminine roles within this, because magic was viewed, at least in some part, as a feminine thing. So therefore, in a sort of a gender fluid way, men could step out of the realm of men and they were into the realm of women by performing Sather, and could take, say, dress in women's clothing or other things and use looms to perform Sather. But at the same time, it should be noted that they would often do other masculine things outside of Sather. So while they would do Sather in the guise of a woman, everything else was done in the guise of a man. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one scenario, and maybe shouldn't be considered a one-to-one scenario, but it does suggest that there was some sort of idea of gender fluidity involved with magic that men could perform. And we actually have examples of this in the lore, because for one thing, as I stated in my last heathen video about chaos worship, the modern LGBTQ community has come to view Loki as sort of their mascot, because he can change from form to form as he so sees, and in fact, in one case, does turn into a female mare who gives birth to Odin's eight-legged horse, Sleipnir. And that's an understandable thing. However, as I stated then, I think that Loki is not necessarily the best choice for this, for a variety of reasons. Watch the video on Chaos Worship to get the context. But another individual could actually fit this better, and that is Odin. Odin himself, who, while in the Icelandic sagas and Saxa Grammaticus, is viewed as the king of the gods, may not have actually originally been the king of the gods. It was actually probably originally the high priest or the high magician. And in the sagas, it often talks about how he undergoes the guise of a woman to perform Sather. In fact, he was taught Sather by the goddess of war and love and other things, Freya. And to the point, so much to the point that in the flighting of Loki, where he becomes chained up in the Icelandic sagas, he goes so far as to call Odin an ergi. So showing that at least in some idea, at least in Iceland, the Norse understood that he, being associated with magic, had some form of gender fluidity or some form of taking on the guise of a woman to perform magic. But again, as I said with the ergi thing, ergi was not a good thing necessarily in Viking society. It was, in their eyes, it was something to be mocked and or killed and outlawed. Not saying that's good. In fact, I'm saying quite the opposite. I think we as a modern society should and can and should do better. But it is something that happened. But we do have another angle to look at, and that is whether or not women could do the same. And we do have some examples of this. In fact, some scholars have begun to suggest that maybe the ideas of Valkyries and Shield Maidens was similar to the idea of gender fluidity with magic, whereas men entered the realm of women to perform magic and such, women could become men or pseudo men to go into warfare. Now, I want to preface this that I don't think that was always the case, and I think that in itself is also a little bit damaging to the LGBTQ community. Again, if you disagree and you're a member of that community, feel free to comment. But when you think about, like, oh, they're doing performing, traditionally male tasks, therefore they're gay, has been used as an excuse for any kind of tomboy or other thing uh, in modern society for decades. So that is something to consider. But we do have some examples of this. The idea of the Valkyrie is one example where they were female warriors who, despite their rather watered down version, were actually in old Norse lore and Anglo-Saxon lore considered to be more akin to the Furies of Greek mythology, or that is, warriors, the gods set on you to either, kill you and bring you to the afterlife, or cause vengeance upon you for one form or the other, and were actually feared. But it does make sense that these women warriors may have been viewed as entering the realm of men in old Germanic culture. But at the same time, they were also considered mythological creatures. So do we have any examples of this in the archaeological record beyond figurines of Valkyries like you see here on the left? Well, we do a little bit. Like the concept of Aryan gay Vikings, it's hard to find in the archaeological record overall. Because even like say in the grave goods of men who have like say spindles or distaffs, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Maybe it was tossed in there by their wife or something. We don't know. But we do have similar things with women, such as the very famous Burqa shield maiden that was found in 2017, that you see here in the picture on the right, where she was found with a sword, a spear, a Dane axe, two spears, a Dane axe, as well as what appears to be a sort of composite bow, as well as being dressed in sort of Central Asian garb. Here's a like what she would have maybe looked like in life. And it's been touted as that she was a shield maiden. And while I do tend to agree that she probably was a warrior of some sort, and that the fact that just because she doesn't have wounds to me doesn't mean anything, because if judging by the composite bow, she was probably a horse warrior, and maybe she didn't receive as many wounds as regular warriors would have been. But either way, this doesn't necessarily mean that she was necessarily, say, gender binary or transgender. But it does show that she did sort of enter the realm of men in terms of warfare. However, another caveat must be added, and that is that warrior women have existed throughout history, say with Milan, Kutlun, and Sorgatani and such in East Asia. But in terms of cultures in or around Scandinavia, you have the Celtic Boudica or Boudicca, I've heard it pronounced both ways, who led the harrowing of the Romans in the 40s CEs. Was known as a very fearsome warrior. And then you also have in Frankish culture, Frankish Germanic culture, you have Brunhild, the inspiration for Brunhilde in the Volsunga and Nibelung, Volsunga Saga and Nibelung, as well as Fredegund, a Visigothic queen who was the rival of Brunhild and was the inspiration for Gunhild and Kriemhild in the Volsunga Saga and the Nibelung. And what's important is in both the sagas and in the historical documents, all three of these women that I mentioned were still considered women. So they may not have always been considered men by entering the realm of warfare. However, that idea of gender fluidity still exists, so it certainly does lend credence to that while they were in the form of warriors, they were considered men, and then afterwards in all other aspects they were considered women, just like while men were in the realm of magic they were considered women, but in every other aspect they were considered men. However, there is much stronger evidence than shield maidens in these to look at, and that is a grave that was found in Finland around This region right here that I'm not going to attempt to pronounce because I'm sure I will butcher it horribly. um, and this individual was found with various, weapons of warfare, such as a sword, various pommels, and of course other not miscellaneous items such as brooches and other things. But what was interesting is traditionally this individual, for decades after being found, with the this is a scythe, with the scythe and other things, was believed to have been a woman. However, recent archaeological study has conducted on it has found, using the femur, one of the few remaining pieces of the femur, because as you can see in this image right here, there's not a lot of bone that survived the decomposition in the soil. But using the remaining femur that they had, they were able to determine that this individual was actually neither male or female, because this individual had an extra X chromosome. So rather than being, say, XX, woman, or XY, male, they had XXY. So they were in between. They were the most literal definition of gender, non-binary. Now, I will also say that it's certainly possible that things were contaminated during this time, and even the archaeologists who wrote the paper mentioned as such. However, due to the methods that they used and the fact that they took account the possible contamination, took into the possible contamination into account, the likeliness of this being a error in data is very low. So what we have here is the best archaeological evidence for the existence of gender non-binary or trans people or what have you, being acknowledged in the ancient world, because we know because I guarantee you they existed back then, but we had very little archaeological record for it. I mean, to be fair, it's hard to tell, based off of bones, what somebody saw themselves as. Just because they, had swords doesn't mean that they weren't, say if they were a woman going to war because they had to because their husband died and they needed to defend themselves or what have you. But this is a good example of it. So this means that this individual, whether they, whether they may have been born, quote unquote, a man, but they viewed themselves as a woman, because all the other grave goods other than the swords were female related grave goods. Now, I will add this other caveat in a video full of caveats. I can't tell you how this person may have been viewed. I mean, the grave goods do suggest that maybe they were buried with some modicum of respect. Maybe they were a leader in their village. But knowing how people who were viewed as ergi or, gay or what have you, in the Scandinavian and Germanic society, there's a high probability that this person faced a lot of hardship before they became respected. It's just something that's impossible to know, but it's something that we can infer based off of the sagas and the mythological evidence. But that's not the point of this video. The point of this video is to determine whether or not they existed in history, which is something that people who are anti-LGBTQ often say, is that other than gay people, no, you never heard anything about people like these. Well, yes, we did. We have the archaeological evidence for it. How often they identified themselves for one reason or another, whether it be fear of being ostracized or because they had no concept of it, is hard to determine, but we do know that they existed. And to say otherwise is to say that they didn't exist is just wrong. And again, like I said in the beginning of the video, I don't always agree with the LGBTQ community, but we do have to respect them as individuals and acknowledge that they have always existed and will always exist, and we need to treat them as people. So they most definitely did. And in the case of ergi and how the people in the past treated them, we don't need to. Please do not take the moral of this video as, oh, because they were treated horribly by our Germanic ancestors, we should treat them horribly too. No, 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 don't do that. In fact, do the opposite. The whole point of this video was to show that they existed in history and to show that because people treated them horribly in the past, we can do better. And we most certainly can. That is something that should always be acknowledged. So, to any focus who may watch this video, as always, fuck you. This is not how it works. We accept everyone, including members of the LGBT community, and they have always been here. And in fact, one of the most respected gods, Odin, is an ergi, was, somebody viewed as some sort of form of homosexuality or gender fluidity. So, yeah. With that, I'm going to end this video. I'm sure it's going to be plenty controversial, but I hope you like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any other subjects that you want me to cover in this vein, feel free to comment. And I hope you all have a good day.